Letter to Philippi broadcast is our first initiative of this new organization, and we will be adding new initiatives as time goes by. So we are going here. And we will get started. So good morning, and this is Sean Inslee from lettertophilippi.org. And today we will be looking at Philippians chapter 3, verses 4 through 6, as we continue our ongoing study through the book of Philippians. And before we get into our study, we'll have a quick word of prayer, and then a little background, and then go into what we call Paul's Jewish resume, his listing here of his Jewish background and all of his achievements as a faithful Jew. Oh Lord, you're good. We thank you for these words of your righteous servant Paul. We thank you for this opportunity we have to study your word. We thank you for this ability to share these words throughout our world via the internet. And we thank you, Lord, for this day. We thank you for our Messiah who gives us life, and in whose name we pray. Amen. So we continue our study through the book of Philippians, and Paul has been focused on, throughout the book, there's the running theme of humility, of which we see positive examples of humility in Paul's life, in the lives of Timothy and Epaphroditus, two men who served with Paul and were familiar to the Philippians. And in the middle of this letter, in the Messianic hymn, or the hymn to Christ, in Philippians chapter 2, we see the highest example of humility, that being Messiah Yeshua, who came into our world in the humblest of births and died the most humiliating death, the death on the Roman cross, the death for slaves. So he came into this world to seek and to save in humility and as a servant of humanity, a servant of the divine plan of the Father. And then in this third chapter of Philippians, we get to see what Dr. David Stern called a negative example of humility, that being an issue of pride, that the second verse in chapter 3 of Philippians warns about these people that he refers to as dogs, evil workers, and mutilated ones. So these epitaphs are used for false teachers. We don't know the identity of these false teachers, but we just know these epitaphs that are describing Paul is using to describe them, and these short descriptions would be something that the Philippian community would know who he was talking about. By these actions, they would know who they are. And as I've seen through my research, since the time of the Christian teacher and church father John Chrysostom, this chapter has been understood and continues to be in Christian commentaries as Paul's renunciation of circumcision, his rejection of circumcision for all believers in Yeshua, including Jewish believers who are continuing to live their lives as Jews. He calls all believers to understand that circumcision is done away with in this chapter, of which we know that is incorrect, that there still is the covenant responsibility for all Jews, those who believe in Yeshua as Messiah, those who don't believe in Yeshua as Messiah, to take that physical circumcision of Jewish males as a sign of the covenant. So Paul here is confronting false teaching. The broadest understanding is that he is confronting those who are looking to push circumcision, ritual circumcision, breaking the law on Gentile converts to Yeshua faith. These false teachers, like what we saw in Paul's letter to Galatia, that these outsiders were coming in and saying that they were had a higher status. They were in essence super believers because they were Yeshua followers, but also circumcised. And they were calling the Philippians to be super believers by them by doing the same. And though it's something I've in a comment from one of my earlier talks on Philippians chapter 3:2, we had one of our viewers comment that there's a possibility that I had not considered, and is not considered in the research that I found, is that these three descriptors, dogs, evil workers, and mutilators, could be three different groups, because usually just all say they're all one. As I said, that the overwhelming opinion of Christian interpretation is that these were Jews, or that they were non-Jews who were calling these Gentiles to be circumcised. So the question is over circumcision. But the interesting thing he pointed out is that these could be three different false teaching groups they were confronting, and that's something I will want to do some more research to look into. And rather than saying that, though it is clear that Paul was not rejecting Brit Milah, because as we see from his own example, he circumcised Timothy before their second missionary journey. That Paul understood the import of circumcision for Jewish males. So this here we know right from the top that in chapter 3 verse 2, when he talks about those who are mutilated, he's not referring to Brit Milah's mutilation, but to a false teaching about circumcision that becomes mutilation. And actually, in what readings I had, they also saw it as a spiritual mutilation, as these Gentiles, if they were to be circumcised, that they were somehow questioning their Yeshua faith, that Yeshua was not enough, they had to add to their Yeshua faith, which was a completely wrong teaching, and something that Paul had to confront. So now, as he's talked about that as we who are the circumcised, we worship the Spirit of God and boast in the Messiah Yeshua. In verse 3:3, he concludes, we do not put confidence in human qualifications. So as Paul has been teaching, is that anything he was to boast about, anything that he was to have pride about, was to be in the Messiah, and boasting in the Messiah, and boasting about the greatness of the Messiah, and doing all he can, not for his own qualifications, not about himself, but putting all the boasting on Yeshua, the one who is our Redeemer, the one who is worthy of all praise, and the one, as we see in Philippians 2, will be the one to which all knees will bow. Any boasting, any sense of pride Paul has, is because of the Messiah and to the Messiah's glory, not about himself, but for the glory of King Messiah. So then we come to chapter 3, verses 4-6, the section they call Paul's Jewish resume, that Paul will lay out his Jewish background, his connection to the Jewish people in speaking about these false teachers coming. And we read in verses 4-6, even though I certainly have grounds for putting confidence in such things, if anyone else thinks he has grounds for putting confidence in human qualifications, I have better grounds. Brit Milah on the 8th day, my birth belonging to the people of Israel, from the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew speaker with Hebrew-speaking parents. In regard to the Torah, a Parush. In regard to zeal, a persecutor of the Messianic community. In regard to the righteousness demanded by legalism, blameless. So Paul lays out his background. Interesting here, as he's talking about that he's not boasting about himself as he ends chapter 3, but in essence here is saying, if I was going to boast, going to engage these false teachers who had pride over whatever it was that they had in their false teaching, whether it was be the somehow they thought they were better some way, they were super believers because of some knowledge they have, it could be some mystical teaching that they hold to, or it could be the fact that they were Gentile Yeshua believers who had also been circumcised. Somehow they saw that as a higher status for them. But Paul here is saying, if though all my boasting is about Yeshua, all praise should go to Yeshua. He is the only one who is worthy of acknowledgement. But if I were to challenge these people who are boasting about their background or their Jewish creds, this is what I have, and I'm going to blow away pretty much anyone who comes to me because of my background, because I was circumcised on the 8th day. I was born a Jew, physical descendant of Abraham. I am from Benjamin's tribe. I know that my tribe that I'm from the tribe of Benjamin. A Hebrew speaker with Hebrew speaking parents, that in my home we spoke Hebrew. In regard to zeal, in regard to Torah, Perush. In regard to my observance, I was a Perush. I was one of the most serious observers of Torah. In regard to zeal, a persecutor of the Messianic community. You talk about zealousness for my faith. I persecuted the Messianic community. I was so zealous for Judaism, for my understanding of my Jewish faith. I actually saw to the death of Yeshua followers, starting with Stephen, and he went throughout the land to find other Messianic Jews. So he's saying, if you want to compare it about zealousness for zealousness, I persecuted the Messianic community. I went right after the community. In regard to righteousness demanded by legalism, blameless. As looking to my observance of Torah, my observance of Jewish tradition, Jewish practice, I was blameless before on that. So he now goes in after he makes the point that if we were going to have a challenge over our backgrounds and our status, then he says, this is what I have, it's really can't be compared to. Many commentators see these verses Paul trying to out-credential the opponents who are advocating for Gentile circumcision and Torah observance for Gentiles by putting forward his spectacular Jewish resume. So one way this has been interpreted, as I was speaking on earlier, is that Paul was saying in here that, not that I'm boasting myself, but if I were, this is what my resume says. Go ahead, look at it. I can't be compared to, if you were just a Gentile who had been circumcised, and think that makes you, more important, have a greater status. Because I'm actually a born Jew, live my life in Judaism, live my life flawlessly, and live my life according to the teachings of the Pharisees. That I was, I was and am, more dedicated to Jewish life, and both in birth and through practice. So those that are saying that he was somehow here that trying to out credential these false teachers, rather than seeking to out credential his opponents. Another way of looking at this is Paul here is placing before the Philippians his authority as a teacher of them as Philippian Gentiles. That Paul here, in bringing forth his Jewish resume, is showing his authority as their teacher, that he has this background not for pride, not to somehow out-credential these false teachers, but to say this is my connection. I am I'm a born Jew. I live my life as a faithful Jew. I live my life now as a faithful Jew, and I am one that has the authority over the teachers. I am the apostle to the Gentiles. I am the one that you should listen to. I am the teacher that has the complete pure message for you. I am the one that has the authority to be your teacher, and these outsiders do not have the authority. Their only authority is in their self, in their own pride. But my authority is from my background and from my calling and my place as the apostle of the Gentiles. Paul's instructing them that the new life within their Jewish life as Gentiles and his authority over his opponents, who are trying to bring the Philippian Yeshua followers into conformity with their former pagan life and norms of society. So Paul clarifies that not only is he a Jew, but he's a Jew par excellence. We see that he comes from observant parents who had him circumcised on the 8th day to observe Torah commands. According to Theodoret, one of the early church fathers cited in the ancient Christian commentary on Scripture, Paul boasted his authority by specifying his descent from Benjamin, the son of Rachel, Jacob's beloved wife. So in his resume, Paul says, I am from the tribe of Benjamin. I'm a descendant of Benjamin, the son of Rachel, the beloved wife of Jacob. To say, one, not only am I a born Jew, but I'm a descendant of Jacob. I'm a descendant of Jacob's beloved wife Rachel. I'm a descendant of Benjamin. So any kind of connection or teaching about Judaism or Jewish practice by these false teachers, Paul says, I'm a descendant of Benjamin. I'm a descendant of the beloved wife of Jacob, the father of the 12 tribes. In these verses, Paul speaks of his connection and his zealous practice of Judaism. He was a student of the great Jewish sage Gamaliel, which you read about in Acts chapter 22, and sought to advance in his learning and practice of Judaism to exceed his peers, which you read about in Galatians chapter 1:14. To prove himself as a faithful and zealous Jew for Torah, Paul here showed no dissatisfaction concerning his life as a Jew, as wanting to practice Judaism with zeal, even going as far as claiming to be blameless about Torah. So Paul here is also bolstering his authority as a teacher over them, saying that I studied at the feet of Gamaliel, one of the great sages of the first century, and one of the great sages of the Jewish tradition, that he says, if you want to know about living life within Jewish parameters and following the God of Israel and walking in his ways, I learned at the feet of Gamaliel, one of the great sages of the Jewish people. And I, as his student, have the authority to be your teacher. And if you want to know how to live within your new life as Gentiles, following the God of Israel, walking in Jewish faith and following the Messiah of Israel, I have that authority as the one who had learned from the great teacher Gamaliel. According to Dr. David Friedman, Paul speaks in the present tense of his life as a Parush, as a Pharisee, when presenting his Jewish resume. Paul here, in contrast to those who say that at his encounter with Yeshua on the road to Damascus, the Jewish Paul, the Pharisee Paul, in essence, died at that point, and he came back to life as Paul, the Christian missionary. That his life as a Jew and his life as a Pharisee ended with his encounter with Yeshua and his becoming a Christian. That Paul had left his faith, becoming a follower of Yeshua. Paul left his Jewish background, his Pharisaical background. But here we see that Paul is writing to the Philippians, as I said, around 60, 62 of the Common Era, near the end of his life, speaks in the present tense that of him being a Pharisee, as a Paroush. Even now 20 or 30 years after his encounter with Yeshua, he still refers to himself in the present tense as a Paroush, as a Pharisee. His understanding of Jewish life, his practice of Jewish life, was as a Pharisee, as a committed, observant Jew, following the Torah commands and the traditions of the fathers. And Paul's zeal was motivated him to succeed in traditional Jewish studies as he sought the highest level of Torah observance taught by his teachers. Paul underscored in Acts 1:14 that his zealousness included his zeal for the oral Torah, the tradition passed on by his ancestors. So Paul is saying, even now, as a Yeshua believer for over 20 years, as a one proclaiming the gospel of Messiah Yeshua, I still am an observant Jew. I understand my faith as a Pharisee that follows the Jewish Messiah Yeshua. He did not leave Judaism to become a Christian, as is common in the understanding of Christian readings of this passage. But Paul here says, I am now, even at the end of my life, a committed Jew, a faithful, observant Jew that follows Yeshua, our righteous Messiah. Unfortunately, he admits that his zealousness for his religious practice led him to persecute the followers of Yeshua and seek to destroy the Messianic community. That his zeal for Judaism, his zeal for his understanding of Torah and Jewish experience, caused him to be so zealous that he wanted to stamp out the early Messianic community. That his zeal was his zeal for Judaism, his zeal for his faith, caused him to seek to destroy the Messianic community. But that zeal was retargeted once he encountered Yeshua on the road to Damascus, and his zeal then went from destroying the Messianic community to building it up, and he is responsible for the spread throughout what we would look as the rest of the common world of his time. In the detailed listing of his Jewish credentials, Paul expresses confidence in them in verse 4. He also sees he said that he expressed that confidence he could express in these parts of his background. But as we say, here he is making clear that any boasting is in the Messiah. That all of this is something that we'll see later in the chapter, is that everything about him, everything that he considers his great accomplishments, are nothing in comparison to knowing the Messiah. Mostly Paul's connection, his abiding connection to the Jewish people, when he warmly describes them in Romans 9:4-5, as we read in chapter 2. And this is from Romans chapter 9, verses 4-5, that the Apostle Paul speaks about the Jewish people, speaks about his people, the people of Israel. And he says, the people of Israel, they were made God's children. The Shekinah, the glory of God, has been with them. The covenants are there. Likewise, the giving of the Torah, the temple service, and the promises. The patriarchs are there. And from them, as far as physical descent is concerned, came the Messiah who is over all. Praise be Adonai forever. Amen. In stating that he's a Hebrew speaker with Hebrew-speaking parents, Paul emphasized that he lived within a Hebrew-speaking community and family, and therefore had a higher status than diaspora Jews. Paul expresses to his opponents who focused on human qualifications that he had better qualifications than they did, which could indicate his opponents had some teaching that was related to Judaism. Paul points out his lifelong Jewish status as well as status as a Hebrew speaker. Paul's listing of his Jewish credentials and heritage in Philippians 3:4-6 and in Romans 9:4-5 brings to mind the Passover song Dainu. In this song, sung during the Passover Seder, we see a progression of 15 miracles performed by God for the Jewish people. Number 1, if he had brought us out of Egypt. Number 2, if he had executed justice upon the Egyptians. Number 3, if he had executed justice upon their gods. Number 4, if he had slain their firstborn. Number 5, if he had given us their health and wealth. Number 6, if he had split the sea for us. Number 7, if he had led us through on dry land. 8, if he had drowned our oppressors. 9, if he had provided for our needs in the wilderness for 40 years. Number 10, if he had fed us on manna. 11, if he had given us Shabbat. Number 12, if he had led us to Mount Sinai. 13, if he had given us the Torah. Number 14, if he had brought us in the land of Israel. And number 15, if he built the temple for us. Dainu. Following the recitation of these miraculous events in the chorus of Dainu, a Hebrew word meaning that would have been enough. The recitation of each of these miracles, from being brought out of Egypt, the building of the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, would in its own right be a sufficient blessing. Each of these 15 on their own would be sufficient blessings. Dainu, that would have been enough. But God did more and more, and we have these 15 blessings that were given to the Jewish people, given to us by God. And Paul is likewise listing out his Jewish credentials, minus his persecution of believers, as blessings from God, each of which is of great value, such as each of the miracles in the song, Dainu, which can stand alone as miraculous acts of the love for Israel by God, with each new miracle being more of a blessing. And Paul here, in listing out his Jewish resume, all the greatness of his Jewish background, his descent from Jewish parents, his descent from Benjamin, his being raised in a Hebrew-speaking home, his teaching at the feet of Gamaliel, his zealousness for Torah, and his life as a Parush. All of these are blessings from God that, like in Dainu, as he lists them, these are not about him and for his glory, but it's for the honor and boasting about the wonder of God, that all of this was done for him. All of this wonder is in his background, in his life growing up, in his current position today as a faithful Jew following the Jewish Messiah. After Paul's extensive listing of all that he can boast about in his Jewish resume, all that he had from birth and practice, Paul made clear to the Philippians that his only source of true confidence was in Yeshua and in union with the Messiah as his sole focus. Though Paul sees these things as greatly important and blessings from God, as he says, his only confidence is in the Messiah. His only confidence is in Yeshua and becoming more and living in union with Messiah. So whatever accomplishments he had were secondary, and even, as we'll see, that he'll consider them worthless in connection to knowing Yeshua. That Yeshua was his only boast. Whatever accomplishments of life he had, it was all for and to the glory of the God of Israel and to give honor to the Messiah Yeshua. And that is his sole focus. For these false teachers, they were boasting in themselves. They were prideful about whatever accomplishments or teachings or practices that they had. And Paul confronts them saying, I don't put confidence in the flesh. I don't put confidence in my own physical background and other things. My only confidence is in the Messiah. And he is calling on the Philippian community to understand that the only status that is important to them, the only thing that is worth boasting and being proud about, is being in union with the Messiah, is only in connection with the Messiah, only by living more and more, modeling the Messiah. That is the only boast. That is the only thing that is of true worth. Everything that we can do, any accomplishments we can have, anything is less than knowing Messiah. Knowing Messiah is the most important part of life. So with that, we conclude our look for today at Paul's Jewish resume as he was confronting these false teachers that came into Philippi, who were overcome with pride in their circumstance, and they're taking on a teaching or practice that somehow that they were commending onto the Philippians to be of a higher status. But Paul here is saying the only status we need to focus on is to being like the Messiah and knowing the Messiah more. Nothing else is of import. No other teaching or practice or anything has any import except knowing the Messiah. And Paul will emphasize it even more as we look at these following verses in chapter 3, where he will say everything about his life is worthless. The only thing of value is knowing the Messiah. So that will conclude our time today. Thank you for watching the Letter to Philippi live broadcast here on Instagram Live. It appears we've dropped out on Instagram Live, so I'll have to post the video to IGTV. But we are on Facebook Live, Twitter Live, and YouTube Live. And we'll have to continue working on that. It appears that the Instagram Live dropped out during the broadcast. And again, my name is Sean Imsley. I'm the founder of Letter to Philippi, a new Messianic Jewish theological organization. And research and biblical teaching is what we do and what we look to build a 21st century Messianic Jewish theology. It's firmly grounded in the scriptures of Israel and the tradition of Israel. And we like you, if you have any questions about our work, just go to our website, lettertophilippi.org. You can fill out our contact form. If you have any prayer requests, I want to be praying for those who are watching the program. So leave your prayer requests there. If you've missed any of these classes, they are available in both video and audio form on our teaching link. And also our audio is actually going out on Apple Podcasts. So if you subscribe to podcasts via Apple for your iPod or iPhone, just look for Letter to Philippi and you can get that on each of our broadcasts as they are posted on your iPhone. And if you like to make a contribution to this work to help us to continue to bring these broadcasts to you and also to expand our work and our research, there's a giving page on our website, lettertophilippi.org. And that will conclude our time for today. We'll have a closing word of prayer, and we will see you tomorrow as we look at Philippians chapter 3, starting with verse 7, and Paul speaking about the cost of knowing Messiah Yeshua. What does it mean to know Messiah and to be a true Talmudim of Yeshua? So we'll close now with a word of prayer. Oh Lord, you're good. We thank you for this day. We thank you for this opportunity to look into your word and help it to mold our lives to become more and more like the Messiah as we study your word. We thank you for this day. We thank you for these words from your righteous servant Paul, that he gave the people of Philippi and now to us here today. We thank you for your love. We thank you for this day. We thank you for this opportunity to study your holy word. And we thank you for Messiah Yeshua, who is our life, in whose holy name we pray. Amen. So thank you for watching, everyone, and we will be back tomorrow at 12 p.m. Pacific time, 3 p.m. Eastern time, 10 p.m. Jerusalem time on Facebook Live, Instagram Live, YouTube Live, Twitter Live, and on lettertophilippi.org. So see you tomorrow. Shalom for now.